The next 4 lectures focus on the figure. We'll start with constructive figure drawing. As the name implies, it involves building the figure using a set of principles. A lot of drawing involves proportion and measure, and that applies here too. We want to control the figure's proportions, so we'll start with linear proportions for the figure, what's termed a canon of proportions. Then we'll apply volumetric solids to make the figure volumetric. Next, we'll look at both the skeletal system and the major muscles in the body and see how we can use anatomical landmarks based on this knowledge. Then we'll see how we can locate a figure in a believable spatial environment by relating what we've studied to linear perspective. In the final lecture in this section, we'll discuss a number of drawing projects involving the figure, both from the imagination and from observation. Students routinely ask me what the correct proportions are for drawing a figure. Both the historical record and nature would indicate there's no right answer to that question. We've been drawing people for a very long time. In summer 2001, Art News magazine ran an article on the oldest drawing of a person that had yet been discovered. It dated back about 32,000 years and was found in the Chauvet cave in the south of France. It was drawn in charcoal on the cave's rock surface. The article describes the drawing as depicting the hips, pubic area, and legs of a woman. Jean-Claude, the leading French scholar involved with Chauvet, described it as an exceptional image of the lower body of a woman associated with a bison figure. The drawing's not unlike some of the sculpted female figures colloquially referred to as Venus figurines. These have been found across Europe and date from about 40,000 years ago to as recently as about 12,000 years ago. The Chauvet drawing's also not unlike a lot of graffiti I've seen in several of the men's rooms at the university where I teach. A lot of the work surrounding the nude unsurprisingly, has had to do with sex, from Chauvet to Picasso to 1950s pinup art and anime. The point is, artists from the very beginning have drawn the body with an expressive idea or aesthetic in mind, and that has, to a large degree, determined the kinds of proportions used. As a teenager, I had the good fortune to study figure drawing with the artistic anatomy with Robert Beverly Hale at the Art Students League in New York. He was a knowledgeable teacher and artist, and the first curator of American painting and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum. In the book Master Class in Figure Drawing, which was based on his teaching, he wrote, "The forms of the body have no exact shape and never have had except in the mind of the individual artist. They've always varied according to the knowledge, the style, and the time of the artist. They have always been created by the artist to conform to his ultimate purpose. Drawing is not a mere act of copying, but a highly creative act controlled by the artist's expressive intent." It echoes a sentiment expressed by Leonardo that tracing nature, while useful, doesn't fulfill, in his words, the final aim of this science. He goes on to tell us what's important for artists is being able to reason about nature with their minds. That echoes Hale's concept of ultimate purpose. Of course, we can't know the ultimate aim of the person who drew that first female figure in the Chauvet cave, but the choices in the depiction, like those in the Venus figurines, are very specific. A look back at 2 Renaissance versions of female figures bear out Hale's assertion about the forms of the body having no exact shape. Botticelli favors a tall, lithe, model-like woman. Michelangelo, who was 11 when Botticelli painted his Birth of Venus, quite another. Eve's been pumping iron. There are few women I've seen in my many decades at the gym who could match her pecs, lats, and triceps. And if you think of Rubens, El Greco, Ingres, Modigliani, Soutine, Freud, well, each interprets or reinvents proportions of both their female and male figures to suit their own purpose. As Leonardo put it, we by our arts may be called the grandsons of God. In this field, you get to make any kind of figure you want. And cartoonists do the same. From superheroes to The Simpsons to anime, each world relies on its own set of proportions. And that's related to the wide range of human proportions we see in nature. To point to some extremes, runway models, sumo wrestlers, ballerinas, NBA players, and jockeys each evince widely different sets of proportions. While less extreme, it's also true of any random group of people you see at the supermarket or on the subway. In the early 1500s, Dürer became very interested in human proportions. He wrote, I know of no one who has written about a system of human proportion except a man, Jacobus, a native of Venice. That would be the Italian Jacopo di Barbari. Dürer went on. He showed me how to construct a man and a woman based on measurements. I was greatly fascinated by his skill and decided to master it. And master it he did. He made hundreds of drawings playing through myriad variations on human proportions while experimenting with different methods of figure construction. This culminated in a lengthy volume on the subject. Published in 1528, it was titled 4 Books on Human Proportion. Like his other book on drawing, it's all about measure. He investigated dozens of different body types, from male, very thin, to female, as he titled her, stout, to small children, and just about everything else in between. So, coming back to the question about correct proportions, there's no one answer, not in art, not in the world in which we live. There are endless combinations. But following in Dürer's footsteps, we can start with one set and then play variations. Before we get into the drawing itself, I want to return to some of the procedures introduced in one of the very first lectures. We found that we could draw complex still life objects more easily by breaking them down to simple constituent shapes: rectangles, trapezoids, hemispheres, etc. Each shape drawn with a single contour. Worked well for still life objects, and it will work well with figures too. Dürer points the way. So grab a pen or pencil and some paper and draw along with me here. We can conceive of the body as consisting of 10 primary parts or shapes, with repetitions for the arms, legs, hands, and feet, 16 shapes in all. Let's start with the largest bone mass. Our first shape, a trapezoid for the rib cage and upper torso. Our second, a smaller inverted trapezoid for the pelvis and lower torso, about half the size of the upper torso. Then the lower appendages, the legs and feet. Our third shape, a longer, thinner trapezoid, one for each thigh. Our fourth, a narrower one for the lower legs. A fifth, a trapezoid or wedge for the feet. Number 6, a subtle trapezoid for the neck. Number 7, a trapezoid for the head. Now to the upper appendages of the arms. Number 8, another thin trapezoid for the upper arm. Number 9, another for the lower arm. And number 10, a small trapezoid for the palm of the hand. We could add 2 more lines for the shoulders and others for the fingers. Some people prefer to use ovoids instead of trapezoids, but same idea. In any case, 10 simple shapes, you get a figure. Each shape represents a body part that moves independently. You can move your upper torso without moving your hips, and you can move your lower arm without moving your upper arm. Internally, though, within each of these shapes, with the exception of the head, hands, and feet, there's not a lot of movement because these shapes correlate with inflexible bone. The forearm, pelvis, or thigh can't fold or bend, at least not unless the bone's broken. For our first figure project, we'll adopt the method Dürer used in his 1528 book. We'll draw 3 views of the same figure. In the center of the page, a front or anterior view. To one side, a side or lateral view, and to the other, a rear or posterior view. After completing this drawing, you'll have a ready method for inflating, compressing, lengthening, or shortening any of the pieces you want. And with practice, create figures with the kinds of proportions you want to draw. In the still life example, we used a vertical center line. Made sense because many of our objects were bilaterally symmetrical. Dürer does the same for his figure studies. Not surprising. While not as symmetrical as bottles, we're enough so that using a center line helps. And I should mention, we're going back to line now. No value, no shading, no mark making, no color, just like Dürer. That's because we want to define proportions. Using value, mark making, or color will, at least for now, just complicate things. Let me take you through the steps. First, we'll establish height proportions. You'll notice that Dürer has horizontal lines dividing his vertical center line into segments. These vertical measures mark locations for anatomical events. Top of the shoulders, bottom of the chest, that kind of thing. The second step is to establish width measurements. These are the distances right and left from the center line. They'll define the width of the shoulders or the width at the top of the pelvis. Once we have these measures plotted, we'll draw 16 shapes blocking in the figure's proportions. Next, we'll talk about male-female variations and introduce contrapposto, and you'll be able to make modifications so that your figure feels less robotic, more natural. At this point, the figure will still look pretty flat. Not surprising, we've only been using contour. Step 4 is to make your figure begin to feel 3D by introducing cross contours and geometric volumes. Our final step in this part of the drawing, step 5, will be to integrate the cross contours with the contours to give us a more naturalistic figure. So let's start with a fresh sheet of 18 by 24 inch paper in the landscape position. Draw 2 horizontal lines across the page. The first 2 inches from the top of the page, the second 2 inches from the bottom. These are construction lines, so draw light and thin. A well-sharpened 2H pencil or a mechanical pencil with a similar lead would work well. Next, 3 vertical center lines, 1 for each view of the figure. The first for the anterior or front view will go in the center at the 12-inch mark. Then 6 inches to the right, we'll put another for the lateral view, and 6 inches to the left, a third for the posterior view. Now we're ready to create our measures along the vertical axis. You'll remember that in one of the lectures on proportion, we introduced the idea of a standard unit of measure, something in the drawing that we use to measure everything else. It's very common in figure drawing to use the head as the standard unit of measure. In fact, Dürer titles or annotates his figure studies with just such descriptions, like this drawing titled, "Strong, Handsome Man of 8 Head Lengths." Like Dürer, we'll construct a figure of 8 head lengths. This means that the length of the figure's body will be equal to 8 of his heads stacked up. We'll start with the front view. Try this by eye first. Divide the line in 2 with a light, thin horizontal line, about 4 inches wide. Next, divide the upper half in 2, then the lower half. Eyeball it, then make any corrections necessary. Once again, divide each section in 2. You should have 8 equal divisions. Take some time to adjust as needed. It's very good eye training. When you're done, check with a ruler. Each unit should be 1 3/4 inches. Then number your head heights. The bottom of the first is 1, the bottom of the second 2, and so on. Let's take another look at the Dürer to see what occurs at each head height. The first head ends at the bottom of the chin. The second takes us just about to the nipples. The third's the navel and waist. The fourth's the figure's vertical center, just about the crotch and bottom of the pelvis. More or less clear landmarks for the upper part of the body. The next 3 are a little less tidy. Number 5 is about mid-thigh. Number 6 falls below the knee at the top of the calf. 7 leaves us just below the calf muscle. And the chin of head number 8 falls in line with the soles of the feet meeting the ground plane. So let's map something similar on our armature. At the bottom of head 1, we'll note chin. At 2, nipples. At 3, navel. At 4, center, bottom of pelvis, and crotch. At 5, mid-thigh. At 6, bottom of knee and top of calf. At 7, below calf. And at 8, soles of feet. We've got a good start mapping proportions, but to locate our 16 body part shapes, a couple other measures will be useful. Let's create a location for the shoulders about 1/4 to 1/3 of a head below the chin. Next, bottom of the rib cage, a similar measure above the navel. Then the top of the pelvis just below the navel. Then the center of the knee, about 1/4 head above head 6. And the ankles between 1/3 and 1/2 a head above the soles of the feet. Now we need some widths. We'll start with the width of the head itself. Let's make that 3/4 of a head length. Make 2 vertical lines on either side of the center line to mark the distance. For a width at the shoulders, imagine 2 head heights flipped horizontal, 1 head in each direction out from the center, from the sternum. We'll add widths at the bottom of the rib cage and top of the pelvis. The first, a bit less than 2/3 of a head height, turned horizontal in either direction from the center line. The second, just a bit wider. The base of the pelvis will be wider, but not as wide as the shoulders, something less than a full head height in either direction. We're ready to begin to block in the figure. We'll start with a larger shape encompassing the shoulders and rib cage. Draw a trapezoid. Next, the lower torso, another trapezoid. And we can add a line on either side of the torso to connect the upper with the lower part. Then the thighs, trapezoids to the knee. Now 2 more, offset just a bit for the lower legs. And another 2 for the feet. Then another trapezoid for the head. Let's take a look at the neck. Here, an anatomical model will be helpful. When we're looking at the neck straight on, it can be deceptive. If you were to outline the figure in this position, the neck would appear to be rather short, about 1/4 of a head height. But if we look from the side, we see the true extent of the neck. It's like a cylinder that meets the back of the skull in the rear and terminates at the clavicle in the front. Feel those 2 points on your own neck. Touch one with one hand, the other with the other. You'll get a sense of the distance. Take the finger that's touching the point of intersection with the back of the skull and pull it around your head past your ear to the front plane of your face. The top of the back of the neck is at about the same height as the cheekbone and about the center of the nose. Also of note, the top of the neck in the front is lower than in the back. Same with the bottom of the neck. So the full extent of the neck can be 1/2 a head or so. Coming back to our drawing, we'll draw the shape of the neck as a subtle trapezoid, as if we could see through the head, starting near the 1/2 measure of the head and extending to a bit above the shoulder line. We can conceive of the cylinder of the neck as inserted between one of the major muscles of the back, the trapezius, and a mass of bone in the front, the clavicles and sternum. Again, put one hand around your neck and with the other touch the top of the trapezius. It's actually a very large muscle and extends from the neck all the way down to the mid-back. To see the clavicles and sternum, let's take a look at a skeleton. And to get a feel for what's going on here, run your hand over your clavicle, starting at your left shoulder. You'll notice first that it doesn't go all the way to the far left end of your shoulder and arm. This bone has a bit of a subtle S-curve to it as we follow it toward the breastbone or sternum. That's where it ends. And on the other side of the sternum, we get a second mirror image clavicle going out to the right. Traces of the clavicles are often visible on the surface of the body, so we'll put these in our drawing. But before we do, let's erase the section of the neck that's overlapped by the head as well as the bottom horizontal. It will make the section read better. Now for the clavicles. Draw a line from the center a bit below the top of the trapezoid and extending up at a diagonal, about 3/4 of the distance to the trapezoid's corner. Do this on both sides. Then from a point along the right side of the neck, a bit below the level of the chin, draw a diagonal down toward the clavicle, but don't let the 2 lines meet. Then do the same thing on the left. Basically, we're setting up a recession of space here using overlap. The clavicles sit in front of the neck inserts in front of the trapezius, and the neck is then overlapped by the chin and jaw. Let's add 2 more lines at the termination of the trapezius on either side, curved line segments to represent the deltoid or lateral extension of the shoulder, and a diagonal on either side to represent the deltoid overlapping the pectoral muscle of the chest. Then erase the parts of the upper trapezoid you no longer need. Let's hold off on the arms. Instead, we'll look at connecting the legs to the pelvis. Here, once again, consulting the skeleton will prove useful. The shape of the pelvis, including the ball joint of the femur, the large bone of the upper leg, is like a trapezoid with a long edge at the base. But the pelvis itself is trapezoidal with a long edge at the top. To make a better connection here in our drawing, it'll help to imitate this structure. So if we modify the miniskirt shape we have into a bikini bottom shape, we'll begin to see the true length of the legs, and erase the unneeded horizontal at the fourth head. This is a good time to review how measures stacking up in our figure. The figure's 8 heads tall. The width of the head is about 3/4 of its height. The upper torso is about 2 heads in height. And at the widest point, the shoulders are about 2 head heights turned horizontally, or a bit less than 3 heads in their upright position. At the bottom of the rib cage, at the abdomen, and at the top of the pelvis, the width is less than the shoulders, less than 2 heads. The lower torso is about 1 head tall, and the width at the base is about 2 wide. The thigh, measured from the hip to the bottom of the knee, is about 3 heads. The lower leg's a bit less than 2 heads in length, and from the ankle to the bottom of the foot's about half a head. Our figure's like Dürer's an 8-head figure, but the proportions are a bit different. Overall, the figure we've constructed is broader in the chest and shoulders. The takeaway is that by adjusting widths to heights, we can get different kinds of figures. Earlier, I'd mentioned that Dürer knew of only one person, Jacopo di Barbari, who was working on a system of human proportions. He was unaware of the work of Jacopo's countryman, Leonardo da Vinci, who from 1490 to 1516 was making scores of highly detailed notebook entries on the subject. His Vitruvian Man is perhaps the most famous example. The figure's a similar number of heads, 7.5 to Dürer's 8, yet he feels a bit taller because he's slimmer in the waist and hips. Botticelli's Primavera is also 8 heads, yet her proportions feel very different than either the Dürer or the Leonardo, less width to height, and of course, she's female. And in that regard, it's worth taking a look at the kinds of proportionate differences artists have routinely used to differentiate male and female. This is a drawing by Jean-Auguste Dominique-Ingres, the great French neoclassicist. He was looking back to the artists of the Renaissance, like Raphael, who in turn were looking back to the artists of ancient Greece. And there's continuity in that long lineage in the way they were conceiving of proportions of the human figure and differences between male and female. You'll note that both the male and female upper torsos are trapezoidal in shape, wider at the shoulder, smaller at the waist. The lower torso, an inverted trapezoid, that miniskirt shape, with a bikini bottom triangle inside the miniskirt. That reveals the true length of the thigh. Legs and arms on both figures taper. But there's several conventions adopted to distinguish male from female. Of course, we have the obvious breasts and sexual organs, but significantly there are differences of measure that affect overall shape. The male's shoulder width is much greater than that of the woman, while her hips are wider than his. When we look at the relationship between shoulders and hips, the male has wide shoulders to narrower hips. The woman's shoulders and hips are more equal in measure. While both figures taper at the waist, her waist is considerably more cinched. The pelvic bones are different too, and they are in nature. The male's has a greater height to width ratio, the female greater width to height. The opening in the male pelvis is more constricted, in the female less so, and the male pubic arch is more angular and acute, the female more curved and obtuse. Because her waist is more cinched and her hips wider, the angle from waist to the hip is more dramatic. Overall, she's more curved, he more angular, and her torso and limbs are all slimmer in relation to their height. And of course, she's drawn to be shorter than him. We see many of these same differences in the Leonardo and the Botticelli, so take this into consideration. Look at the proportions in your drawing and personalize them a bit. I'd like you to leave the heights and limb positions the same, but play with the widths and the degree of tapering. Retain the shape vocabulary we're using, trapezoids, Straight lines only, no curved lines yet. We'll get to those, but if you curve things now, it'll make some of our next steps more difficult, like transferring the proportions from the central figure to the other two views. For now, play with the widths. You'll feel the personality of your figure change as you do. Now, there's something else you may have noticed about Dürer's and Leonardo's figures in contrast to Botticelli's and Ingres. Both the Dürer and Leonardo are studies on proportion. The figures, like the one we've been drawing, are in static positions, straightforward, everything lining up horizontal and vertical. Makes sense, it brings out the measure of each section or limb. But we don't generally stand like this. Try it. It's much more relaxing to put the weight on one foot, like the Primavera and the couple in the Ingres. We call this contrapposto. Now the shoulders, which had lined up horizontally, line up on a diagonal. Same with the hips, the knees, and the ankles. Let's look at the male figure in the Ingres. His left leg takes the weight, his opposite hip, his right hip, moves down. There's not enough room for the length of his leg in the contracted space, so it goes out to the side. So the hip taking the weight goes high, hip no weight, low. The bottom of the pelvis follows suit, the knees follow suit. The shoulders move opposite to the hips and thighs. Hips and knees one direction, shoulders the other. The woman puts her weight on the right leg, and everything happens the same way as in the male, but in mirror image. Good composition. If she stood with the same contrapposto, much less balance. It's important to remember that it's not just the top of the shoulders or the top of the hips that are moving, it's a large mass of bone. When we tilt the shoulders, the mass of the rib cage moves. When we tilt the top of the pelvis, the whole pelvis and femur move. So I'd like you to apply this idea in your drawing. First, using your kneaded eraser, erase back, significantly lightening the upper and lower torso, and then the left leg. You want to just be able to see them. Then redraw the trapezoid of the pelvis tilting down from left to right. Add the triangular bikini bottoms inside. It should be the same shape but rotated. Next, redraw the trapezoid of the upper torso tilting up from left to right. Then add lines for the sternum, clavicle, deltoids, and the pectoral muscle. Then erase the parts of the trapezoid you no longer need. Repeating this will help you cement this construction. The shapes don't change much, only the angles of the shapes. The whole assemblage rotates together. Next, some line to connect the upper and lower torsos, and a bit more to connect the lower torso to the right thigh. Let's take the left leg out at a diagonal, a trapezoid for the upper leg, another for the lower leg, and a modified wedge shape for the foot. The left knee should be tilting below the right, the left ankle tilting up, and make sure the big toe of the left foot lines up along a horizontal with the right foot. Now let's add the arms. We'll draw them extending out at an angle, palms forward. Starting with the right arm, draw a tapering trapezoid from the shoulder. It should be about 1 head length. The upper arm's total length, including the shoulder or deltoid, should be about 1.5 to 1 3/4 head lengths. Make its width go with whatever choices you've made when you altered your figure. Next, another trapezoid for the lower arm, again about 1 head length, and the hand about 3/4 of a head in length. Repeat these steps on the other side to draw the remaining arm and hand. And let's erase the portion of the upper arm that's overlapped by the chest. Then the line separating the shoulder from the upper arm. And finally, any of the non-contrapposto figure you no longer need. You've now seen how we can use a canon of proportions to draw a figure. You've also seen how small changes in proportion and position can influence the feel of the figure. We'll continue this drawing in the next lecture. We'll add 2 more views, posterior and lateral, direct some attention to the head, hands, and feet, and learn how to make the figure feel more 3-dimensional.